Tarpley in Washington, and this is the afternoon of Friday, the 5th of February. We got the Dow down 150 points. But the Dow is now 98.50. That means they've lost about 1,000 points since the speculative bubble top was put in sometime in late December, early January. So hold on to your hat. I have predicted this now, I think, in a number of places. The second wave of the Depression, it's based on the Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain bankruptcy situations. The British are certainly a part of that group, although they don't like to be mentioned in that context. And, of course, the commercial real estate crisis, the defaults on many, many leases now coming due. Those losses go to the banks. That has caused some jitters in the stock market, continuous high unemployment. I think it's now the unemployment supposedly went down to 9.7% this morning, but that is simply that people are giving up and they're just not registering because there's no more benefits. If you've exhausted your benefits, you're out of luck. And now the immediate stimulus package increases of a year ago to prolong the unemployment benefits, those are now running out. States are increasingly bankrupt. So we don't need monetarism. We don't need more deregulation, privatization, budget cutting, austerity, free markets, and all this claptrap. And we sure don't need cap-and-trade Malthusianism and all the rest of it. We have a viable economic tradition. It's called the American system of Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, Matthew Carey, Henry Carey, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt, New Deal. Throw in the populists, too, because they're definitely in the tradition, the real populists of Omaha 1890, calling for a whole series of measures, including parity prices for agriculture. And if you like to eat, you better have those. So in terms back to China, though, the Chinese are antagonized, as we've said, over Taiwan, Tibet, the Uyghurs, South China Sea, cyberspace, Google, the human rights questions, the renminbi, and trade protectionism. Now, all of these are important issues. And again, I would say to the Chinese, drop the one about protectionism. Everybody in the world is going to need a modest protective tariff of 10 to 15%, and the U.S. will be lost without that. So I'm afraid at this point the U.S. actual national sovereign interests overrides the desire of the Chinese to dump cheap goods, if that's what they're doing, or anybody else's. We've got to have a return to some kind of a tariff protection for the protection of domestic wages and standards of living against sweatshop labor, operating with cheap raw materials on cheap land and so forth. Otherwise, you simply can't compete. However, the perspective for the U.S. is to move ahead in key technologies. We'll get to that in a minute. The multilateral issues are, of course, the fact that the Chinese blocked the carbon dictatorship at the Copenhagen conference. This is now, I think, essentially proven to anybody who wants to see it. The Chinese did a very clever strategy. They used Sudan and a certain number of Latin American radicals and third world radicals in general. That was their screening force, and they blocked it. And they snubbed Obama in the process, and they basically said, why should we submit to having a worldwide carbon dictatorship, the main purpose of which would be to strangle China and strangle India, along with anybody else who wants to develop under this carbon dictatorship. So there's a huge resentment from people like Prince Philip, Prince Charles, right, the lunatic Malthusians of the decadent European aristocracy and titled nobility, and their friends like Al Gore, who is obviously a satellite of these circles. And then we get to the Iranian sanctions, and that's the one that could blow up in the face of the world because, of course, you've got wild cards. You got Iran. What will they do? You don't really know. What will the Israelis do? You don't know. What will the Saudis do, right? Once the lid is blown off of this, then it becomes uncontrollable. The U.S. obviously thinks that if Hormuz is closed, the sufferers will be Japan, who get 90% of their oil through there, not even 30%, but 90%. China will suffer, others will suffer, and Europe. The U.S. probably less, and they would even say if oil goes to $1,000 a barrel, that's good for the dollar. That will create a massive demand for dollars, and you better do that if you're going to do it before the the posted price for oil is no longer in dollars. Because once it's no longer in dollars, then you don't get any benefit. You only get the problems. And, of course, you'd be essentially extorting, you'd be getting the Chinese to use their $2.5 trillion of foreign exchange. You'd be saying to them, we're going to essentially rob you of that. We're going to force you to pay that at $1,000 a barrel for oil. And the key thing then is to break these contracts, which the Chinese have made with Iran, to lock in reasonable prices. Now, behind all this, an obsession in the Anglo-American elite. It's similar in some ways to the British looking at Germany before 1914. And here's the big issue. The U.S. can look at China and say, well, we're going to contain China. We're going to try to wreck them and sabotage them and break them up and embroil them in conflicts. We're going to use economic warfare, and we're going to foment conflicts. We're going to try to play India against China over these border disputes, which are heating up to some extent. We're going to use the Iranian gambit to hurt China. Maybe if we can get Russia voting for the sanctions and China voting against the sanctions, we can split Iran. Iran can be used to split China and Russia. This is the road to tragedy. This is what the British tried to do in the 1930s. This basically says Sir Neville Chamberlain is going to build up Hitler. I'm not comparing anybody directly, but just I'm talking about the sort of formal structural aspect of this thing. They said, we'll build up Hitler, play him against Stalin, get rid of both of them. And it didn't work, did it? It blew up in their face. So this kind of scheming and meddling is typical of imperialism, which is in desperate straits. The alternative, of course, is a peace race of peaceful economic development. This is what I recommend, because instead of having the conflict scenarios, the economic warfare and the conflict, which harm everybody ultimately and could blow up the world as we know it, go for a peace race of peaceful economic development. Here, the U.S. obsessions are that China is now the largest exporter in the world. China has now passed Japan, or soon will, to become the largest economy in the world. I'm sorry, the second largest after the U.S. In real terms, it may be that China already is in terms of production, in terms of tons of steel, and so forth. And when you take the physical economic indicators, the Chinese may already be ahead. Because when you look at the U.S. GDP, you've got to remember a lot of that is derivatives, a lot of that is payday loans, a lot of that is stock jobbing and financial speculation, which has no relation to wealth. It's purely paper, it's parasitical, it's actually a net loss. So maybe the Chinese are closer to being the biggest economy in the world. If you don't like that, then go for economic development, go for a peace race, and you'll do just fine. Back in a minute.